each one of us, we are 3 speakers in today's series. We are going to talk about our research and what possibilities we can think of in terms of interdisciplinary research, and then just leave things open for the audience to jump in, talk, discuss ideas. So I know some of your faculty, some of your students, it would be nice to get your feedback, what you think about these projects. I've chosen a topic which is close to my heart, and that's the research I've been doing, is mainly looking at poverty levels, income inequality, and how these questions are connected to the development in countries. Okay, I need to figure this out. All right. So I'll quickly give you a broad review of my research so that you have some substantial idea what I have been doing. I'll give you some examples of my recent work, and the series title for today is Technology, Development, Economics and Human Rights. So how does it fit into this broader title? And lastly, what are the different ways in which we can see collaborations appearing in this part. All right, so a bit about the research. The broad umbrella, if you think of, is the reference period is the last 20 years, which I have been looking for. And that was the time sort of when I became an economics student and countries were undertaking the so-called globalization process. So I was a master's student in India, and we had economic liberalization adopted in that country. We had major structural changes coming into the country, trade liberalization, financial deregulation, and so on. And like many countries, we had the same debate: how is it going to affect poverty levels, income inequality? Is it a good change or a bad change, and so on? So I started looking at this whole debate, and as an economist started looking for answers in terms of data. What can I see from the data? Can I answer some of these questions looking at the data? So broadly, my research has sort of followed the pattern of looking at globalization and its consequences on these two broad themes. One is poverty, deprivation. You can think of inequality. I have recently worked on multidimensional deprivation, not necessarily income poverty. And the other one is, of course, the talk about income inequality. We have Thomas Piketty's book, which is making some news recently, which is talking about the top income shares in different countries, and income inequality has increased over the last decade or so. So if you see, income inequality is a tops-down pyramid. We have about 82% going to the top 1/5 of the population, and less than 3 to 4% to the bottom 10th of the population throughout the countries. Let me give you some research examples of the questions I have asked or tried to answer. One of them is looking at the impact of growth and income distribution on income poverty. So if you think about it, there are two ways in which can happen, and all these changes happen usually simultaneously. You cannot have growth followed by inequality changes, followed by changes in poverty. So it's very hard for us to separate out these impacts of different factors. So one way to look at it is, can we have a counterfactual scenario? Can we develop a counterfactual scenario? And that's what I did with this project, is looking at the Indian income distribution. We would say that if the economy grew at, say, 8%, but if distribution had not changed, what would have been the poverty levels? Then turn the question around and say, if distribution changed but we did not have any growth at all, what would have been the change in poverty overall? And we got some interesting results in the study, where the large impact or the significant contribution to the decline in poverty was coming out of economic growth. So though there were concerns about inequality, the impact of inequality on reducing or increasing poverty was much smaller, and maybe that was because of the time period. The growth process usually starts to have an effect immediately than the inequality process, but that was the way in which this question was addressed. There is another way. I am sort of I trickle sometimes with the data by doing some non-parametric econometrics, so that's another field in which I work. And here we looked at the non-linear relations. So this is, I'm looking at different examples to give you the scope of the data I have been using. So this is looking at cross-country data from the World Bank, and we look at different countries, developing countries, and we see that can we have some kind of a functional relation between inequality and poverty. So we are looking at what we economists call the elasticity of growth for poverty. If 1% increase in income, how much poverty does decline, right? But that depends on how your distributions are going to change. So we see that the relation is definitely non-linear, and then we suggest a different way of approaching or measuring this elasticity. A third research example is where I look at global poverty. So if you look across the theme, it's the common thread is mostly measurement. So I look myself more as a measurement economist. I look at different ways in which these indices are measured. And one of the questions is, why do global poverty estimates differ so much? This was brought into picture mainly when we had the Millennium Development Goals and everyone was sort of racing towards trying to reach those 15 targets for developing countries. But when researchers were estimating that they had wide discrepancies in which they were measuring global poverty. Global poverty is typically defined as $1 per day poverty or $1.25 poverty line. And you can see that though the trend is almost the same, there were wide discrepancies in which the bank measures, which independent researchers like Salai Martin would measure, and there was a debate about these. If you dig deeper into that, we had a method, this was mostly a methodological paper looking at what are the different assumptions made when people talk about global poverty, and not many people are aware of these assumptions when you are thinking of $1 per day poverty line, but you are looking at data sources. Where is the data coming from? You're looking at, is the data based on household surveys, that is a data, or is it coming from national account statistics where you get an estimate of what would be the consumption of households? So that's going to be a very different estimate than if you do the survey data. There are methods in which you can estimate these income distributions. There is the scope of analysis and all the different adjustments you need to make these estimates comparable. So we give sort of a range of poverty estimates which would be comparable, and not going into the details, but you can just see the variations in which if you apply one assumption at a time, how the poverty measures change. So a note of caution, this world development, and we got some readers writing back saying that they have sort of lost their faith in global poverty measures. Well, that was not the intention of the paper. The paper is sort of making readers aware that if you want to follow a measure, you need to know what all different assumptions are made and not compare oranges to apples then, because the poverty levels will change depending on which, on all those different factors that you are looking at. Currently, I'm more involved in this project, which is looking at multidimensional deprivation rather than poverty or income poverty, where in the US we are sort of outdated in terms of how we look at poverty. One thing is our poverty lines are defined by family size, all of you are aware of that, and they are updated over the years because of inflationary pressures, but they do not differ across regions. So a person with some standard of living in say Iowa is compared to a person with a different standard of living in California, and you are using the same metric, which is a big problem. And of course, there have been many different alternatives, but the official statistics has not changed, mainly again because I did wonder why the official statistics did not change. And I was visiting this National Poverty Research Center at Wisconsin, and the faculty or the researchers there, they were senior faculty, they were like, oh, it's impossible for US official poverty measures to get changed at any time, just because they're entrenched in so many welfare programs that it's politically not going to be feasible for anyone to touch the poverty thresholds anymore. So what has been happening is we have experimental poverty measures, we have something called the supplemental poverty measure, which changes and give different estimates, but they are not used for the program or the welfare program purposes. So what this multidimensional approach is looking is, it's considering all different well-being indicators. So you don't want to just rely on income, but you are looking at more of the philosophical approach by Amartya Sen, which is looking at capabilities of an individual. And can you capture the capabilities? The philosophical foundation is much stronger. It's very hard to bring into practice when you're looking at data. And you just look at different dimensions. You look at health dimension, education, standard of living, and so on, and try to see if there is some data available on one individual across these different dimensions. So this approach is much more data intensive. You want to have data on each individual on different indicators, and then you define sort of the poverty or the deprivation level. Giving you quick result on that, for 2011 we did the calculation of population because we are looking at adult indicators. We found 1 in 5 individuals in the US were multidimensionally deprived, whereas the official estimate was about 12 to 13%. So definitely deprivation is much more entrenched than what you see in terms of incomes, and that is what the paper is bringing the value on. My last slide, and that's the messy slide which I tried working on in the morning, and I then sort of cleared it out because I was drawing these diagrams and these arrows connecting one thing to the other, and it became like a web or a spider. And in a way it was a good sign because I could see these connections, but then I said, okay, let me just put out all the arrows and just keep some of the bubbles, which I was thinking is where is the overlap coming in. And I could think of all these different roles, and I have seen people at ISU work on some of these topics. So these are the type of keywords which I can think of when I'm thinking of, say, deprivation. I'm thinking of human rights in some way. I'm thinking of inequality. It's not always income, it's access to technology, or we have a growing literature on energy inequality, energy poverty in developing countries. We are looking at globalization and its impact. We are looking at conflict and poverty, how are they related? We have people working in the health area, and this is a closely related topic to, again, deprivation in multiple dimensions. So I sort of just laid this as a mosaic, and maybe we'll come back once we have the sessions open. So I'll stop over here. Thanks for your audience. And I think we are just going to continue with the speakers and then maybe take up questions. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you very much for coming. Today was a weather shock, so which may have affected attendance. Carol said 35 people registered, but my research is broadly on armed conflict and economic development. And just to give you an introduction, about 1/3 of all developing countries experienced conflict as recently as 2002 to 2008. And the aggregate of impacts of conflict have been studied, and primarily they've been studied in developed countries. Over a couple of countries with very good data, Japan and Germany, Vietnam, and we find that countries will go back on track pretty soon, 10, 15 years, and you are sort of back on the growth trajectory or population growth trajectory. But with respect to individuals who were exposed to these life-changing events, even if you look at this great recession that we experience here, I mean, sort of like we are back on track, stock market is booming, right, like hitting the highs. I just heard the report on the jobs, and they appear to be good and optimistic. But there is a generation actually that lived and grew up during the Great Recession, and it may have affected them in a profound way. So thankfully, since it's a developed country, it's not affected them in a way that will impact them, let's say, in terms of like negatively with respect to their health. It may change their worldviews, most likely, and like jobs that they go for. But in developing countries, many of those shocks, they have profound impact, basically, during the conflict. I mean, the food supply is low. There are migration, diseases that affect individuals and households. Countries can't catch up because their infrastructure is being destroyed. And those, like early age impacts are very hard to reverse. Let's say you grow, instead of growing up like that, you're growing at a different trajectory, you are shorter, maybe you have less education because you have to keep your siblings in school. And you have like lower lifetime income. So, and I thought of it, how does it tie with respect to human rights? And with respect to human rights and human capabilities. Because why would you think like conflict, it should be somewhere in security studies, right? Like, but it fits together very well with, because it impacts many aspects of human well-being at different levels. For example, Millennium Development Goals, we were trying to achieve it by 2015. I guess it's not going to happen in many countries. And all of them, right? If you look 1, 2, 3, reduce child mortality, 4, improve maternal health, combats AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, those actually would be impeded by the conflict of fragile environment ongoing. Refugee camps serve as a great breeding ground for all kinds of infectious diseases, and it impacts neighboring population that may be actually just hosting the refugees. So all of those are related to conflict and could be improved. And the last 2 goals are sort of maybe higher level goals. Once you achieve, good health, you are not likely to die tomorrow. Like when you focus on some other aspects which are, sort of a little like higher on the hierarchy, like lower on the hierarchy of needs. So I also looked at core capabilities that should be supported by democracies. And some of them we take also for granted, living in a democracy in a developing country, but some of us wouldn't be taken for granted in conflict-affected countries. For example, life, ability to live a productive, healthy life until normal length, you're not dying prematurely. Bodily health, good health integrity. You are move freely from one place to another without being assaulted, right? And that affects individuals in conflict-affected environments. Another thing that is important, actually, and I thought of it, ability to being able to have attachments, right? Attachments to people that you like, and people who are outside yourself that you find important and without being persecuted for those attachments. And that happens in countries affected by political repression, such as Zimbabwe, North Korea, under Stalin, right? Like, I mean, officially, if you are son of someone who has been repressed, you are not, and shouldn't be under attack, but it's remembered, it's long remembered. So applies also to other things, like practical reason includes freedom of religion, and we go to freedom of affiliation, right? Freedom of affiliation, non-discrimination, protecting institutions that encourage forms of social interactions, and control over one's environment is also being impeded under the conflict because there are different groups and you are basically in constant danger and potential loss of life, right? So if we are going to OECD definition, well-being has several dimensions, and income is actually one of the dimensions. Shatakshee mentioned that, but it's one of the important ones because once you have like a high level of income, you are able sort of to buy many other aspects of your well-being, right? You are able to care for, get an education, have cleaner environment, have a relatively long and healthy life. For example, we had a talk by Ken Arrow last year, and he said one of the global achievements over the years, one of the global development achievements is like life expectancy, that it has increased in many countries, and it has increased at a steady rate, and people living longer, right? So people are not expected to live like to 50 years, like on an average, which is actually true for conflict-affected countries. For some of them, average lifespan is 46 years, so which is pretty long. So my research focuses on impact of armed conflict on households and individuals. So those individuals living in extreme environments, Like, so we're affected by different kinds of shocks. It could be income shock, it could be shock of security, right? You can lose your assets, you can lose your life, you can lose your loved ones, you may not be able to travel, to sell your crops. So my studies addressed a number of questions. I have a focus also on human capital development, such as education and health. And I looked at that in India, Tajikistan, Zimbabwe, and Côte d'Ivoire. And I looked at migration and remittances because households, they live under those risk conditions and insecure environments, but they adjust, right? Let's say we have heavy traffic in Atlanta, people adjust, they change their behavior. Same happens here, people adjust, but how do they use their adjustments, right? For example, recently there was a number of reports looking at brides, young brides of Syrian refugees, right? If anyone caught a story, what happens where women, like very young, I don't know, women, like you can't call them women, they're teenagers, they travel with their families, their refugees, and family says, like, okay, you can't stay with, we don't feel that it will gonna be safe for you to be unmarried, right? There are many young males around, why don't you get married to someone else, someone of? And like we don't have enough income, so you go to husband's family, they take care of you. Sounds good, right? But is it a good strategy? It feels good sometimes, like, right? Like, but many of those girls, they end up with children born at like 16, 15 years of age, right? It's lifetime changing impacts, and many of them were still children. Like, so the education has been interrupted, and some of them actually go back to live with their families because my husband don't want them anymore, like so. And that's one of the coping strategies that could be used, right? By households. So with displacement, you have a large displacement of population, of movement. You have different deprivations in terms of your income. You have no access to infrastructure, which is often destroyed, or it would be unsafe for you to travel. And society is less trusting in the, as a result of war. For example, we looked at a study with my students, and people said an interesting thing. We looked at the community in Sierra Leone that experienced war, and they said, people said, we trust people, but not from our village. We trust people outside, but not from our own village, because probably we have a good reason not to. So the research line addresses a lot of important questions, and it's generalizable because the methods could be applied to situations such as impacts of terrorism, natural disasters, random acts of terror or crime, because basically what we look at how people change their behavior when they experience some kind of shock. So a civil conflict is an extended period of shock experienced over time. Let's say with terrorism events, probably everybody remembers Boston bombing, right? Boston Marathon bombing. We have a family who lives in Boston, and that summer, after the bombing, we visited them and said, like, why don't we go and watch the fireworks for 4th of July? And they said, like, we don't go to public events with children anymore. Because, and then I read an article that looks at the technological aspect of it and says they are now like actually doing a lot of imaging and screening people who attend different kinds of events, right? Sort of like if you go to a concert, there is a lot of cameras around, and they know who, face recognition technology. So it affects society in different ways, right? Like at the technological as well as individual level. So I use rigorous analysis. I can use data from households and individuals that are collected by reputable organizations, and those data becoming more and widely available. So those are some of the websites that host the data sets that range from 2,000 households, which could mean about 16,000 individuals in one. And with respect to conflict, initially I started by collecting data myself from various sources, like reading news reports, reading books. And here you have a lot of investment because you have to understand what's going on, right? You have to understand who is involved in the conflict, and then you have to map those locations because they do change names over time. And now there are data sets collected by third parties, there is a Peace Research Institute in Oslo, very well known in this field, that collects, that was one of the initiators of collecting armed conflict locations and event data set. So we do, almost now real-time tracking from news reports and focus on Africa and a little going further to India and Afghanistan. This is some of the data sources I use, people use a variety of them. So I look at them, two recent representative projects. One recently has been published in the top field journal of development economics with my colleague who actually traveled to Côte d'Ivoire. She was a country economist for Côte d'Ivoire quite a few years back. And another is with Prakash Singh, who is at Amherst College. So the first project, we want to see how conflict in Côte d'Ivoire affected children who were very young, between age of 0 and 60 months, which means they're under 5 years old during that time. And what we particularly were really excited about that paper is, or about that project, that the government decided to collect the data on household experiences during the conflict. Typically, governments, they may not be wanting to do that. Let's say in many countries that experienced conflict, they don't collect ethnicity data anymore because it could be dangerous. Or they don't want people to be potentially identified later on. Let's say Tutsi versus Hutu in Rwanda. So that's Côte d'Ivoire, former economic powerhouse of West Africa, actually quite wealthy country for the region. And when it was hit by the conflict, when the conflict just started, and actually I spoke to two students, now actually they are professors at different places, who were students from neighboring African countries studying in Abidjan at the time. And they all report that, we were worried. One said, I was hiding under my bed for a number of days, I couldn't go to school. Another said that we had high security around the president's palace, but the problem was that it also was a target, potential target, by the military. So that's the northern region of Koroga that was affected by a lot. The rebels came from this region. So the conflict was, it's followed sort of similar path as many. It was about 5 years long. But with respect to the war, not so many people died directly during the conflict because there was an initial wave of violence and people split between two sides of a region. But displacement of population was substantial for a country which is about 14 million large. This size is pretty high, right? So 25% to 12%. So, and since the conflict started, a little bit with respect to voting rights and benefits of being being from Côte d'Ivoire, your parents being born there. So there was widespread harassment of foreigners and migrant workers. There was also a lot of anti-French sentiment because French participated by providing forces. So we use data on violence from armed conflict event locations data set, and basically we match it to different provinces in Côte d'Ivoire. So, and the darker shade of province represents more events reported in that particular data set. So, and if you notice here, the many events reported in the western region, although originally people said And we read multiple reports trying to identify which region was more affected. I mean, from qualitative data, like the quantitative data says that. But what our report said, like that most of the conflict happened here, rebels were here, and the government-controlled territory were here. And here there was a lot of degradation of public health services, public education services. So that western region is, interestingly, it's bordering Liberia with a lot of violence, and Liberia at that time experienced war itself. There were refugees camps across the border, and according to reports, like Liberian militias also crossed the border to Côte d'Ivoire, and they were particularly violent, as reported. So I use a statistical regression model. So the thing that I want you to think about is my dependent variable. What I want to see the impact on is height for each Z-score. It's a long-term measure of child health. Basically, it shows how child is developing. So because height, you can't sort of catch up on height very fast. If you lost height, you can catch up on weight, but not on height. I want to estimate if being from that conflict region, from the darker shade region, had an impact for being a very young child during the war. So, and if you're looking at this table on top, you find actually sizable impact at 3.4 standard deviations, depending on the regression model. Which is comparable to our studies on this topic. So like the negative, it means that it's negative impact, and it's highly statistically significant, so it means that it's robust, that we would find this impact if we try to do a study again and again for a different set of children. So another exciting thing, as I mentioned, was here like when we had like victimization categories, and if you notice here, we have conflict region, non-conflict region, and people from both regions respond that they lost assets, they lost some kind of livestock, but there is more reports in conflict region, more people also were displaced if they had more violence reported in that region, and more places were victims of violence, more people. Okay? So that's a nice map. And also like when we map it by victimization level, it shows that again, actually, bordering Liberia, although we did estimate robustness to it, was an important for having all those shocks here. So basically, we find very similar impacts with respect to child health as from our studies, and economic losses. That's like one of the major contributions. We find that economic losses are part of other types, in addition to other types of impairment during a conflict, are very important and profound impact on child health. So, and this is another study. I'll just go very briefly through it. It's with, we look here at the impact of a Punjabi insurgency. And Punjab is a state in India, and it's twice the size of Côte d'Ivoire with respect to population. It's 27 million individuals live there. So the roots of insurgency were complex. It was about, started with language not being recognized in schools, like there was a separatist movement. The Indian government tried to tackle the insurgency by attacking the insurgents who were hiding in one of the biggest Sikh temples, which actually led later to a backlash and assassination of Indira Gandhi by her 2 Sikh bodyguards. So there were anti-Sikh riots, and Punjab was characterized as a case of civil war. So what is interesting here, because it's a regional insurgency within a country which hasn't been studied as much, because like a lot of research has been on, empirical research has been on sort of whole country conflict. So, and we find that children, particularly girls, were lost in terms of education. They were underachievers in terms of education as compared to boys from this region. And we related to potential gender discrimination by families in this region. So, and if you look here, like we'll see some common themes, like so, like we like maps because we want to do a lot of historical analysis to understand where the place located, what does it border with, how did the conflict spread between different regions, and you could see that like sort of it starts somewhat slow, and then it spreads all over with great impact in different locations. These are some of the pictures of the impact associated with terrorists operating in the state of Punjab. And there are definitely controversies. Some people would call these people terrorists, some people call that it was not like a terrorism, it was a liberation movement, right? So those are the timeline of killings, and it's like of civilians and terrorists and of security forces. So it didn't come out very tight, but you could see that there is more of civilians and terrorists, and like there is a very similar pattern across all types of deaths, like with respect to type. So if you look at common themes between most of my projects, it's I do like my co-authors do a lot of historical and institutional analysis of a country case because we want to understand actually what happened, how it happened, like what were the sites there, what were the economic situation, what factors affected population. We collect the data, or like we use second-party sources on data, and we try to map it and try to understand because I like visual representation, and it's moving towards that. And we do rigorous statistical analysis, what we are trying to do where we are trying to pin down that the conflict impacted the individuals. It's not something else. It's not that they were poor beforehand, and that's why we find this impact. We want to conditional on poverty. Was it impact of conflict that we observe? And we are trying to go like through a lot of hoops there to see what happened. So I have several new projects and ideas, like some of them draw on my research with respect to conflict, looking at dam construction in Cambodia and the land conflict it created because it displaced people, and also potentially health impacts there, firms and conflict in India. We have a panel data set coming from Colombia and data coming from various sources, from households as well as government, the government. And we are lucky to know people who collected those data. So, and some of kind of our projects that look at trying to look at Iran-Iran conflict and nighttime lights, looking at so there is a now interesting area taking off in economics, looking at sort of at spatial variation. How do we measure spatial growth with respect to nightlife? Perspective using a lot of satellite data that people have been collecting over years, and now it's finally becoming available. Now you have computing capacity to analyze it. And I have kind of project that I'm actually very curious about, looking at the impacts in city regulations of aggressive panhandling that happened all across America during the recession time, and looking at the impact of crime. So is there some kind of transference mechanism there? So, and I have a project with Earth and atmospheric sciences where we'll use like land cover and land use in Central Asia, also satellite mapping with respect to finding what changed. So, and here are some potential collaboration opportunities, like my research addresses gender and education and health. I think I see it going towards a lot of use of a lot of satellite data over time, making use of information there. And big data methods, for example, I've been approaching people have, let's say, cell phone records for all people in Côte d'Ivoire that moved around. But, and I'm really hopeful that we can use some of computer scientists here like to be able to analyze this data and to map it.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming out on this rainy day. Really appreciate it, Friday afternoon. I want to thank Carol for being the force behind this series. Anything that brings together the faculty across, whether it be the Institute or the college, I think is really valuable. I want to thank Olga and Shatakshee for inviting me to be the fill-in speaker. Originally, I was not scheduled to be on the part of the series, and I'm quite honored to be speaking. And originally, when Olga asked me, I sort of made this observation that, well, yes, a lot of my work deals with technology. There are aspects that deal with development, but I don't really do human rights. And I made this comment to a friend of mine who's a reporter at the Pittsburgh Tribune, and he very quickly, said, hey, you probably should revise that in the event that you appear before the International Criminal Court someday. My area of scholarly expertise is not human rights. Although ironically, and I'm going to be talking about a couple different disease outbreaks, including the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and ironically, this public health military nexus, when President Obama was here in Atlanta at the CDC making the initial announcement with respect to the sending of 300 troops to West Africa, the impetus that he invoked largely had an underlying human rights. It was responsibility to protect, that the United States has a responsibility to take our capabilities, our capacities to address this potential global scourge. So very much couching it in human rights language. Of course, what he could not say was, we're going there because we don't want it to come here. That is, that's, as the academic, I can say that. So again, I'm going to be looking at some of these issues. Global health security comes from a project that I started about 4 years ago, where I was really interested in deterring bioterrorism. And then I'm going to sort of track this forward. And as I was listening to Shatakshee and Olga, I'm sort of seeing places that I didn't even realize where our work has potential to intersect, because some of the causal variables of why these outbreaks are occurring are civil wars, are poverty, are efforts to deal with those. Okay, so the original motivations for me pursuing this work. I do largely international and domestic security, national security. That's the realm in which my scholarship, my work is situated. So specifically, I was interested in looking in new ways to deter bioterrorism. So deterrence, of course, is a concept, comes originally out of criminal justice, but has a long history and a wonderfully developed theoretical foundation in terms of nuclear deterrence, states, state behavior. So I'm interested in how do we think about deterrence from nuclear to bio, and then also the difference from states to non-state actors. And it should be acknowledged that there are many terrorism experts, including Martha Crenshaw, one of the leading terrorism experts at Stanford University, who challenge the idea that terrorists can be deterred. Now, I'm in the camp that says, yes, there are mechanisms, it's just much more difficult to deter terrorists. This goes to these broader issues of international domestic security and issues of reducing the threat of weapons of mass destruction to the United States, to our allies, and to the global community in large. One of the pieces that we can look to is, in particular in the case of Al-Qaeda, is that one can find evidence, clear evidence, of interest in acquiring biological agents. This is sort of the first thing you have to do, is rather than just toss out there that, well, yes, non-state actors want to acquire these, it's how do we determine that they want to and show that they're actually interested in using them and for what means. And I have a whole nother brief where I go through this, so just in some encapsulation, focus on a couple different things. One, the rhetoric, what do they say, what do they print, what do they promulgate, And then just as important from my perspective is what are they doing? So you start looking at the material aspects. What are the facilities? What are they doing in terms of actual attempts to acquire? As opposed to just talking about this, is there evidence of actually pursuing that? And in the case of Al-Qaeda, particularly Al-Qaeda in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, there was clear evidence both in terms of the rhetoric as well as activities looking to acquire biological agents. And then finally, all of my work is motivated by this sort of intersection of bridging the liberal arts and social sciences, this terrorism studies, deterrence, securitization, and the life sciences, and epidemiology. So our bridging across the different sides of the institute and over to places like CDC, with coming up with ideas for implementable and executable policy. How can our robust scholarly work have implications in the national and the policy realm? And just a couple examples of that. CTR, being from the Nunn School, Cooperative Threat Reduction is part of our fabric, our weft and waft. As one example, thinking about 21st century cooperative threat reduction, and then science diplomacy. How can scientists be engaged as individuals to do what's called track 2 diplomacy? So these were some of the original motivations as I started this project. And this project came out of observations, as many times projects do, in which there was a re-emergence of polio, initially in the northern 3 states of Nigeria. Specifically, it came out of the northern state Kano, that in the course of 2 years, reinfected 16 states, went from less than 1,000 cases of polio in 2003 to more than 61,000 in 2005, including reinfecting countries like Indonesia that had been polio-free for more than 10 years. So in October of 2003, Muslim clerics in this northern state of Nigeria declared that all polio vaccination would stop. And there were a variety of different reasons given. They were things that one encounters, like there was concern that this was going to cause sterilization in infants, or there were rumors that this was then going to cause it will sterilize male babies or cause AIDS in infants. So these northern Nigerian states, which are Muslim, they basically stopped immunization in October of 2003. Immunizations did not begin again until August of 2004. You saw this re-emergence of polio. It spread to 21 nations within 2 years. It's notable where it did not spread to. You do not see it spreading to Saudi Arabia, although this is followed basically the route of the Hajj. Saudi Arabia put in place strict entrance rules in terms of you had to demonstrate you had been vaccinated from polio to get into the country. It also did not spread to Northern Europe, places in which there are large Muslim populations, but have much more robust public health infrastructure. So as I went through this, and I began what I call rethinking bioterrorism deterrence, polio emerges as a case study in which one can think about the role of the public health infrastructure, which has been previously acknowledged as having a role with respect to responding to bioterrorism. This is our national capability and our capacity to respond to bioterrorism. Thinking about it more broadly in terms of its role in deterrence, that is, as one communicates, and particularly communicates credibly, the ability of a nation, for example, the United States, to respond to infectious disease, largely through our public health infrastructure as well as other mechanisms, we are communicating that even if you use an infectious disease, it is not likely to impact us. Rather, it disparately impacts one's own community in these states in which you have low public health infrastructure. Strategic communications becomes much more important in these cases, and that is the ability to communicate this in a way that is commensurate with our broader strategic position and also commensurate with the goals of public health, which you're never going to come out and say, oh, we're not going to fund robust public health in order to increase our deterrence, particularly in other states, because there are broader conditions. So one has to look at this as a much more complicated situation. Polio was initially looked at as an interesting model because it is a contagious infectious disease, it's transmissible human to human, but it's not perceived as a bioterrorism threat. And when one is talking about, particularly in the policy world, sometimes it's useful to talk about things that are not the agents themselves. And I'd previously looked at this in the context of work I'd done with regard to contaminating the food supply. Looked at a case in which alpacas were killed. Anybody have seen an alpaca? They're little llamas. There was an outbreak in which the feed for alpacas was contaminated, and almost 10% of the U.S. alpaca population was killed. Now, very few people ever heard about that because alpaca does not play a big role in our economy. Now, on the other hand, if 10% of the cattle, 10% of the pigs, or 10% of the poultry were killed, that would have significant have significant security. So it's talking about, one can sometimes talk about and look at issues related to terrorism by specifically looking at a case that has all of or very similar characteristics, yet it is not an agent. So that was why polio was one more reason why it was really interesting to do this. In doing this work, he also did some very, very simplistic analysis looking at the comparison of investment in public health infrastructure. And I'm acknowledging that is very simplistic because I'm speaking with two colleagues who do hardcore quantitative work. So we were just looking at what's the investment per capita, and one finds, not at all surprisingly, that the states in which you have higher investment per capita, you get less likelihood. So there's a lot of places where this could be done much more robustly, and I think you could pull further on the initial results. So I want to shift now with that brief sort of look into one project to thinking about some of these questions in the context of Ebola. And I'm in the process right now of thinking about how this is going to be influencing future work of mine. Notably, first piece I want to talk about is how it connects back up to polio. Since 2005, there has been a reinvestment in the attempt to eradicate polio. The goal is to eradicate polio by 2019, make it the second infectious disease ever eradicated from the planet, following smallpox. Significant effort has been made by the WHO and the CDC to do work in Nigeria, because Nigeria is one of the three remaining states where polio is still endemic. Afghanistan and Pakistan are the remaining two. India was just declared polio-free about 6 months ago. So there are polio vaccination teams in Nigeria. There's a strong, robust organizational capacity in Nigeria. There are logistics change, and they have established relationships with people throughout the different levels of the government in Nigeria, including individuals who are from Nigeria, from those states affected, who are the ones who go out and are the actual face of the vaccination teams. So when we had the 19 cases of Ebola that popped up in Nigeria, what the WHO and the CDC basically did, this is a bit of simplistic, but they said, okay, you guys who are polio, you're now Ebola. And most importantly, they were already there. They had been doing this for 5 years. The infrastructure, the organization, and all those different pieces were already in place. Now, you're not vaccinating against Ebola. You're quarantining and you're isolating. And it's credited that having this infrastructure there, organizational capacity, enabled them to stop the spread of Ebola in Nigeria. So you have that fast organizational response with strong local connections. So one of the fundamental questions that a lot of people are asking right now is, why is this outbreak different? More people have died in this outbreak than have died since Ebola was discovered in 1976. We're over 6,000 people infected. Previously, it had been about 5,000. So there are a number of different potential explanations. The first one is very much going back to the biology. Ebola is a virus that is considered to be a fast evolver. It uses something called horizontal gene transfer. It's estimated that, and there just was data that came out in Nature about 3 months ago, where they looked at it, and the initial outbreak that started this time in Sierra Leone, that was then taken to Guinea, it's had about 395 mutations since the Ebola that it developed from 10 years ago. So that was what started it in Guinea. There have been 50 mutations in the Ebola in the last month. And that would be it was published in July, from June to July. So this is a very fast mutating virus. Some viruses are very stable. Smallpox actually is an incredibly stable virus. Ebola, on the other hand, just by the nature of it, is a very fast evolving virus. So that's one explanation. Of course, that's also the explanation, or the characteristic that prompts concern about Ebola becoming air transmissible. Currently, it is not air transmissible. You actually have to come in contact with fluids. So there are the other questions, which I think in many ways are the much more interesting ones, particularly interesting from a social science perspective, is what is the relationship, potentially causal, with respect to differential development and investment. Now, it's well known that roads in particularly helped the spread of AIDS in the 1980s and the 1990s. That is, largely, it's as there have been investments in building roads, you no longer have isolated communities. In the past, Ebola has largely occurred in small, isolated communities. So it essentially, and sometimes it's said, it burnt itself out. Well, now you have people who are traveling, so people are not becoming symptomatic, can take up to 21 days to become symptomatic from Ebola. Most of the time it's shorter than that. But you can travel because you have the means and the infrastructure is there. So while we've invested in development for things like roads, there has not been commensurate development investment in increasing these public health infrastructures in these nations. There's a whole lot of reasons for that, and there's not been commensurate emphasis on education. A number of these places, the idea of germ theory, which is basic to us, situations where you have people who do not understand germ theory, that is that germs cause diseases. This is why we wash our hands before you have somebody go into surgery. So you see concerns with regard to attribution. Now, one has to be careful in terms of the education placing too much emphasis, because it was revealed about 2 to 3 weeks ago that there actually are lower vaccination rates in some of the richest parts of Los Angeles County for MMR, measles, mumps, rubella, than there are in South Sudan. So one has to look at and sort of pull apart not only the education, but also some of the ideological, the cultural, and the historical issues. And again, it goes back to those local connections. But I particularly want to highlight, again, I'm leveraging the work that's been done with respect to AIDS and the transmission of AIDS. This is a paper, this is a graphic from a paper that appeared in Science, literally the most recent issue of Science, in which they did genetic fingerprinting and traced the evolution of the AIDS virus back to the 1920s and saw how it moved along the rails, the railways in the DRC, the 1920s up through the 1960s. So not an unprecedented explanation, but in terms of thinking about this in the context of the current Ebola, it isn't just thinking about the roads and the infrastructure, it's how have we invested differentially. We invest in roads and these other pieces that are seen as part of economic development, frequently without investing commensurately or even significantly at all in public health and sometimes in the education. We like to build things. We frequently do not fund the continued training and the continued education and the paying of the individuals who are supposed to be instructing. So these differential pieces. And I'm very interested in the securitization of public health and civil-military relations. So we have this global health security. If one goes over to the CDC, they are now being funded by the Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense. This one part of the CDC, the Global Health Security Initiative. So you've got the DoD funding biosurveillance by the CDC. 20 years ago, public health very much had a divide with the military. And this, over the last 20 years, has been significantly eroded in a whole number of different contexts. But here is a real blatant and particularly striking example. It should be noted that there also are aspects that have to do with personality. Tom Frieden, who's the current head of the CDC, is very close friends with Andy Weber, who's the current ASD, Assistant Secretary of Defense, who's very interested in biosurveillance. Traditionally, the ASD is filled by an individual from the nuclear weapons laboratories who have historically treated bio as an afterstat as well as chem. So it will be interesting to see as the next ASD comes in, does this continue? And is this going to be a change in the direction with regard to the DoD? Which sort of goes to the next piece, which I'm very interested in, which is this fundamental question of what is the military for? So among the military's core mission, something called HADR, Humanitarian Assistance Disaster Recovery, is considered to be one of their core mission areas. Now, going into the 21st century, is the United States military, is that going to be its reason for being, and particularly the ground troops, the Army and the Marines, to respond either quickly in the case of the Marines, or the Army in terms of having the capacity and the capability to be there for a significant amount of time? Is this going to evolve to be the reason, one of them, and an increasingly large reason for our military? It should be acknowledged and recognized that the U.S. military is the only one who has currently within the United States the capability and the capacity to respond to this. The only one who has the numbers, has the logistics, just has the pure manpower. And part of this has to do with the last 30 years of budget cycles in which funding for program execution, particularly USAID, has shifted away from government individuals, has shifted to contractors, or has been decreased significantly, whereas military budgets have increased. And this is not my observation. This was directly from Secretary of Defense Gates in his 2007 Landon lecture, in which, while serving as the Secretary of Defense, he advocated for increasing the State Department budget and USAID budget because he recognized that the military, at the time, he was looking mostly in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan, the military was doing what was seen as the military role, but in terms of counterinsurgency, there was a need for these other aspects that the United States did not have the capability and capacity to because of the decrease in the budgets to these other agencies. So the military is becoming the Stucky. And is this going to shift the mission? First of all, there's the sort of normative question of should this happen? And then there's this question of is that in the best interest of the United States? Is that in the best interest of what of effectiveness? So Operation Unified Assistance is the name given for the deployment of these 3,000 U.S. troops to Liberia. There are at least 175 troops currently already in Monrovia. And there are some interesting pieces here that I'm going to be pulling on in terms of looking at organizational interaction. Officially, USAID is in charge. The military is supporting USAID. Now, it's not quite clear who in the military, in the DoD, is the sort of piece in charge. On one hand, you have Andy Weber, the ASD NCB, Assistant Secretary of Defense, Nuke Chem-Bio, who seems to have been given some policy imprimatur to be in charge, and unquestionably is coordinating with CDC. When I was at CDC on Wednesday, people were talking about how they were going to be responding and how this policy at the Pentagon level, these are the guys who are going to be leaving for Monrovia either within a week or less than that. So then I'm talking to guys from U.S. Army Africa, who at least one of them is already on the ground in Monrovia, who are reporting up through the AFRICOM, which is a combatant commander. And I found this wonderful, so here we've got Michael Lumpkin, who's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations. So you've got Andy Weber, who's an ASD. Michael Lumpkin is also an ASD. They're at the same level. One's in acquisition technology and logistics. The other one is in policy. So there's this, what's going on here in terms of who's in charge, what's the orientation, and here we've got Lumpkin. Again, he's the Assistant Secretary of Defense. It's actually for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict, SOLIC. And I love this quote. Just the complexity of running an Ebola treatment unit was not apparent to me until I saw it firsthand. Now, as someone who's spent a career focused on logistics issues, he hasn't spent a career focused on logistic issues. He's a former Navy SEAL. He retired as a captain from the Navy, as a Navy SEAL. So logistics is a really kind way of putting what he's done. But he's characterizing this complexity, as being dealing with responding to Ebola as being more complex than many of the things that he had seen previously. As he goes on in this interview, he talks about it. It has to do with dealing with the different parts of government. Because when you go in and you do a counterterrorism operation, which is mostly what SEALs do, among other things, you deal mill to mill. SEALs generally do not have to deal with foreign governments. They don't have to deal with USAID. They don't have to deal with foreign public health, foreign government. So it becomes the complexity here. And we've got multiple different organizational levels that one, in terms of looking at a case study to understand how does policy actually get implemented. And as social scientists, we love to think of new policy. At least I like to think of new policy. But this question of how do you actually implement it, I think may be the much more interesting one, understanding how that happens in these very large international structures. And with that, I will conclude, and I thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
bottom
Yeah.
30,
7%
yeah, whatever,
something.
right.
And actually this morning that Empirical news mentioned about this, that over the history that we had US, 11 recession and recovery period. Researchers found that whenever we go through recession and recovery, the proportion going to the group of the bottom 20% significantly diminishing. And earlier, like in Great Recession, 80% of the gains out of the recession and recovery went to the ordinary people. Now only 20%. So this makes the inequality, income inequality, dramatically increases. And he mentioned that President Obama mentioned several solutions for this. One is that large investment in the education and entitlement fund. And another one he mentioned about higher minimum wages. And I wonder that is there any the research looking at the relationship, either the large investment on education or entitlement funds or the minimum wage, how it affected to the income inequality over time.
Okay.
So that's I asked
Okay.
you. And I have
Sure.
a separate question to you, but
Okay, I can, just to answer a quick one. Yes, there is a lot of research on education, definitely, and its impact on inequality. Specifically, it's looking into investment in human capital. So it's either education in terms of primary or secondary enrollment, but also in terms of job training, worker skills associated with the jobs and so on. And you have sort of lowering of the inequality as you move up on the investment in education and human
so
capital.
for example, that
This would be
Obama
mostly,
really pushing that
right.
higher minimum wages. Is there any enough evidence
Well, with
that
minimum wages,
it
it's
will help
right.
the inequality issue?
Right. With education, there is a clear-cut evidence. So you can go by country statistics, you can go by China, you can go by the US and with the solo and the other work and so on. With minimum
So
wages,
when
right.
the US government invests more in the education, that overall in the long term, that inequality, that
will,
problem has-
yeah,
Okay.
right. And what you noted earlier was quite true, and it has been sort of again documented the way the Great Recession happened, say 1920s, and the recession this time, because the structure of the economy has changed, especially for the US, talking about the US, and that is why it is taking so long for the impact of the recession for the lower income people, because of the type of economy we have. It's more service oriented, much larger than what we had in the early 1930s and 40s, which was much more manufacturing oriented, where you could see that job creation happening much faster than what is happening right now, where you are seeing more of outsourcing type of service going on with that.
So suppose President Obama is here, if you are given a chance to give him one advice as an expert economist on this issue, what would you suggest other than this higher minimum wage or the
Minimum wage, I'm not
Okay.
an expert on that, so I haven't commented on minimum wage. For inequality in the US.
Inequality, yeah. US inequality.
I would go for taxes.
Taxes?
Yes, definitely. We need much more progressive
And
taxes.
Republican.
And they are much more regressive. Yes.
We do know the minimum wage that there's a very strong impact on current minimum wage. Met increases unemployment, especially amongst young Black males in their income when they started doing the progression. So I think in Atlanta, the unemployment amongst young Black males went on over 50%. And that really is going to be a very long-term thing because those people are just not going to make it in the workforce. So we do know that segment of the population, again, minimum wage increases unemployment directly and
let DC finish up your. You had two more because your question was much, much.
I have a question to Professor Shemyakina. And one question is that, like, so you mentioned about immigration is caused by conflict, but there is a lot of immigration caused by non-conflict causes, right?
Right.
So I do not know what is the scientific methodology to sort out what motivates the immigration. Some for example, education and some motivated Korean immigrate to US a lot, and there were not conflict issues there in South Korea recently. But I knew that there is some country that caused by the conflict. There are huge chunk of the immigration. Also, there is a very, very mixed regions that not only for the conflict, but also not other, not conflict. I really do not know that how we scientists can catch the different, if the degree of the migration is driven by different factors. I just wonder that how development economies are thinking about that. That was my question when I listened
Well,
to your.
I mean, if migration caused by conflict, you will see a large outflow of people happening at the same time from the same country, right? Like same like timing would be important, right? Like when in addition, if you have like some underlying factors where say government repression that drives people out,
But
it's
also at the same time, the non-conflict regions may drive some significant of the number of the people that migrate as well. I understand the timing really matters here, but it's not always decisive factor, depending on the cases.
So you should think about like why it is important for you to separate them. Like we usually want to see if conflict has caused people to migrate and what impact did it have. For example, there is a study on Bosnia that looks at displacement of people, and where displacement was driven by non-economic factors, where Bosnians living in particular regions
But
before.
the
And
reason I'm asking this question is why it is an important question is that when conflict is over, there are some people might go back to their own country if that conflict was the main reason. If the conflict was not the main reason, other regions driven them to migrate to the country, then they might not go back. So therefore, once the brain has been drained, it's different dynamics depending on which factors drive them migrate. That's why I come up with this question.
I mean, people collect huge amount of information on individuals, like in the surveys. So, like, if you look at any of the surveys, like it's a wealth of information. It's like that. So you can have a lot of observable factors on those individuals, on regions they come from, and you can study. I mean, I can send you a paper that looks at it very much in detail. That studies, puts together many pieces of information and studies why people migrated from that region, right? So like there is like a lot of data on individuals. Richard has a question.
Thank you for the talk. I've been thinking about how to kind of put this stuff together. And what I would love to see, I think is really cool, to address the problem in my mind that the American public is kind of blissfully unaware, just doesn't want to pay attention. And to get this Ebola outbreak truly has the average American attention. How can we broaden this out such that we can start addressing these problems, taking account concern about Ebola? And what I would love to see is that we somehow build a geographic information system database where you portray the disease stuff, how it spreads, you portray the poverty stuff, and you portray, in a sense, the conflict stuff and the conflict of that. You know, overlay those different layers of data to see the relationships. And when people are concerned, it might be, well, hell, maybe we should be putting more money in USAID so we don't have things like Ebola hit.
That's a great idea.
Maggie, would you want to? Because
I think it's a great observation. I think it'd be really interesting. Either you have an extensive experience in doing some of this visualization, which it is incredibly powerful to be able to communicate visually, and that is the power and the force that one can get from using
significance was.
Yeah, but actually that's a thing that you find in Africa, because in gender discrimination is particularly found in East Asia and South Asia. In Africa, women, there was like historically high mortality. Any labor is important. Female labor was highly valuable in the fields as well. So they actually, in Africa, they give money for the bride. So like, let's say, if, I don't know, BC wants to marry someone from there, like he has to give like a big prize, like bride prize to her family, right? While in South Asia, it's other way around. The girl's family has to give a dowry, and it reflects sort of like the relative, I guess, abundance or like use of labor. So for Africa, it's actually has been in many cases consistent across countries that women are not, when you have a shock which is sort of unexpected, somewhat, women are not discriminated.
That's interesting. Chris, coming back to your broader comment on that. No, hopefully, yeah, hopefully you don't go back feeling depressed, right?